Hi, everyone. Welcome to Micromobility and Your City, leveraging mobility data to achieve policy outcomes. My name is Madlyn McAuliffe. I lead communications for NUMO. NUMO is thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with SAE's Mobility Data Collaborative. A quick note before we get started, we're going to hear two short presentations, both from NUMO and some of our advisors and people and partners we've been working with, also from SAE's Mobility Data Collaborative. Before we go into a discussion with our panelists that will delve more in depth into the topic of mobility data, policy, privacy concerns, etc. That will be followed by a question and answer session, and we'll be collecting questions from the Q&A feature here on Zoom, so please submit them whenever you feel the burning urge to ask a question. So first off, we're going to hear from Sebastian Castellanos. Sebastian leads our research efforts for NUMO. So I'll hand it over to Sebastian now.
Thanks, Madlyn. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Madlyn just mentioned, we're really thrilled to be co-hosting this with SAE's Mobility Data Collaborative. What you'll hear about today is really some of the work that both of our organizations have been doing for the past 6 months or so on the topic of mobility data. So we have been openly collaborating with a whole host of different people that represent different organizations, and you'll be hearing a bit about the outputs of these two pieces of work. So I'm really happy to be joined in this webinar by all the different people that you'll hear from. I can tell you that these are some of the smartest voices on the topic of data and mobility that are open today to talk about these issues. And I think what's really important is that the people that are talking today are also representing a lot of other voices of this collaborative work that we've been doing for the past 6 months. So I'll just hand it off right now to Russ Brooks. Russ has been leading on behalf of NUMO the work that we've been doing on mobility data and looking at how to incorporate policy outcomes into this fairly newly developed space of data. So I'll just hand it off to Russ.
Thanks, Sebastian. I appreciate it. So I just wanted to start and talk a little bit about the process that NUMO has gone through over the last few months to really take a look at micromobility data and how we can really use that data to leverage the policy outcomes that cities and operators and others have really stated as being important. NUMO formed this working group after holding a couple of ideation sessions last summer, really. And in the fall, decided to bring together a working group really comprised of a number of different stakeholders, given the real explosion that micromobility has had or services have had in our local communities, really, and the desire to better understand how those services were impacting our communities for the good, the impacts that some of the negative consequences that they might be having, but really with the understanding that there's still a lot that we don't know about these services, how they operate, and the impacts that they're having in our local community. But also, I think there's a really great desire to refocus the conversation around outcomes and what is important as we think about new services and new mobility options that are entering cities. What's important? What do we want to learn about them? How do we want to shape them in order to meet our outcomes? And really start thinking about a framework for how to gauge these services and their impacts, but also to think about what may be coming next, so that when the next iteration or the next form factor or the next service comes, that there is a framework with which to kind of measure that against. NUMO put together a working group, and really the working group, the idea behind it was to bring together a diverse group of players in the industry. It was about bringing together cities, about bringing together operators, data aggregators, and NGOs and other nonprofits that are advocating around these issues. And so that's what we did. You know, we brought together about 65 different people from a number of different organizations that you can see here. We brought them together in person. We held meetings virtually. And thankfully, we were able to bring them again in person before. So we were able to sit down and really have a number of conversations. So, you know, we started with shared micromobility data. That was always the focus from the beginning. And there were certainly a lot of questions as we went through this process about why micromobility, why not everything? And really the idea was to start with something narrow, to start with something that was more definable and develop a cohesive process, build that framework. But we know that this doesn't operate, or these services don't operate in a vacuum. And we think that much of what we've developed here that the working group came up with really does apply to other existing modes, but also future modes that'll come. So for today, this is really focused on shared micromobility data. In the future, we hope that it grows and we can use this really to talk about different impacts of different services and modes. So, you know, as the working group really started thinking about things, we narrowed things down to a set of outcomes that we thought were broad outcomes that were really universal across cities. Now, the details of them might certainly be unique or different to each local community. But broadly, these were the topics that cities expressed that they were interested in, that operators expressed that they were striving to meet goals in. And so we started with really three main categories. We started with equity, safety, and the environment. And really, we felt like just about everything fit into these three categories. When we wanted to talk about things like infrastructure, as you'll see, we felt that they fit under a specific category, safety, or that they fit under a category like equity. We thought that it was really important to tie everything back to these main outcomes in order to really organize things properly. And then lastly, we have a fourth category, which is really about general usage, which is how, where, and by whom these services are being used. So I'm going to switch over to the website here just to give people an opportunity to kind of get a sense of what this website's going to look like. So we have really, like I said, focused on outcomes. So everything on the homepage really does lead directly down to the outcomes that cities are particularly interested in. As I mentioned, equity, safety, and environment. So I'm going to go through it a little bit here and just show you what you'll be able to do on this website. But basically, at the bottom of the website, everything is organized in a couple of different ways. We have grouped everything under broad use cases, which I mentioned, and the use cases are under each subcategory. So under equity, we've broken these down using Rachel's work at Remix as a starting place to access to necessities, access to platforms, and access to vehicles, and felt like these are the three main use cases under the equity outcome that cities and others have expressed interest in. And so all the metrics, all the questions, and all the data flows underneath each one of these. So I'm just going to click on one just to give you a sense of what this looks like. But if you travel to this use case and then take a look, you'll be able to really take a look at the different questions. So we felt like there were kind of four main questions under this broad evaluation of access to necessities, excuse me. So underneath each one of these questions, we have a number of evaluation metrics. So if the question is this service being used to increase access to necessities in the community? These are the metrics that we have developed kind of broader evaluation metrics that we think can answer that question, or at least track progress to or from that goal. Underneath each one of these, then, there is a required set of data that will be used. So if you clicked on this one, for example, it automatically jumps back over to our data page, which allows you to see every piece of data that's necessary for calculating that metric. And this was a big part of the work that Rachel and the others at Remix did, was really breaking down these metrics into very digestible cards, really, for each piece of data that's necessary. So that's really the base of how the website works. I want to share another tab here for you to be able to see. Under our safety outcome, for example, education is one of the use cases. If you, sorry, my mouse got a little away from me there. You'll notice that this one's a little different in the sense that there are evaluation metrics, there is a policy metric, and there are equity metrics that apply to these. And I'll come back to that in a second because I think it's important. But we've also, the group had suggested potential policies that might be applied under each of these use cases that cities have at their disposal to drive the outcomes that they're particularly interested in. If there's a sample policy, we've also really offered up a compliance metric for that policy. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there are equity questions and metrics. The group thought it was particularly important to make sure that we looked through every outcome area through the lens of equity. So while equity is a broad category, under safety, under environment, there are equity-based questions that we think are important and that are applicable and are really critical to be tracking. Because, for example, under infrastructure, it's important to know, say, how much infrastructure is being created in local communities for active transportation and micromobility use, but it's also critically important to know how that infrastructure varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, and especially in communities of concern or in underserved neighborhoods. And so we've taken that tack with really every different question and every different metric here. We've run it through the lens of equity in order to make sure that gets a focus as well. So the last two things that I'll share here really before I turn it over to Rachel is that there are a lot of metrics in here. We have roughly 145 different metrics here based off of 50 different questions, or 60 different questions that the group thought were important and metrics for really tracking progress towards those questions. It's a lot. There's no expectation that every city or operator really use all of these, certainly not on a daily basis, but the goal for the group was really to be as comprehensive as possible and to know that every city and every operator and every city operator partnership has different goals and outcomes that are particularly of high priority to them. So we wanted to make sure that it was comprehensive, but cities and others will need to really think constructively or thoughtfully about what is most important to them and what are the goals that they've prioritized, and then choose the metrics or the questions that they think are really the most applicable. So on this data and sources page, for example, you'll be able to scroll down and look at all the different metrics that we've created. And every time you choose a metric, the page will resort and let you know which data is necessary in order to inform that metric and to calculate that metric. So there really is kind of a ton of information here. Each one of these cards tells you the source of the data, or it tells you exactly what the data is. It tells you the source, and then there's a short description to let you really know what it's about. So you know, as I said, there is a lot here. It's really incumbent upon users to kind of think thoughtfully about what are the most important things here, but we really have tried to be as comprehensive as possible and be able to speak to as many different local communities as possible. And the last thing I'll share before Rachel kind of talks about how they translated these metrics into individual data pieces is really our introduction page, which has a lot of the content and the text about how we approach this, about the process that we used, and really then how we viewed our top 3 categories and the ways in which we looked at them. So I would encourage you to take a look over there. So I will just kind of pause there and turn things over to Rachel just to talk a little bit about Remix and their involvement.
Awesome. Thanks, Russ. And thanks to the audience for making time to come out for this today. I know these are really stressful times. We're all learning a lot very quickly about equity. So I'm glad that these can contribute to the conversation, but I'm sure there's much more to learn. I know I'm learning every day now. I also just want to say that, you know, Remix has been working with NUMO for a long time, since the early workshops, and we've learned so much from them. It was really special to get to be a part of this. And of course, as one of the leading platforms for helping build solutions for micromobility planning, we were more than happy to help out and assist on the data component and share in our expertise, which is a small slice of this problem. And then finally, before we get into the how, I just want to say that a lot of this came to be because of Russ's amazing organization skills. I mean, to be able to plan for breaking this down into little parts for easy navigation was no small feat. And that comes from, I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the folder structure in his toolbar, but he's a very organized person. So big thanks to that. So Remix was asked to take the metrics and break them, identify which data and data sources were necessary to solve the metric equation. And so we basically had a few parameters, which were to minimize the necessary data as much as possible, prioritize accuracy over ease. And what that meant was that some metrics could be calculated in more accurate but complicated ways. That's something like a software platform set up to do, but perhaps a city is not. And so we always opted for the, like, you could get there with this solution in that respect. As long as it didn't have any impact to accuracy. So the other point I want to make there is that this is a work in progress, and you know, there could be a couple different ways to get to the same solution. So we're always open to hearing from you guys. Really excited to like share this with the world and get some feedback. Feedback is a value of Remix. And the other thing that, you know, we wanted to say is that none of these metrics on their own have privacy risk. However, handling discrete trip information does. And so just a share of precaution around using raw data, and that you should frame these analyses with thoughts around a large enough time arc or geographic area such that they aren't dangerous towards privacy. And I think those are my 2 bits to share about Remix and the data process.
All right, well, thank you, Rachel, and I appreciate that. And I just wanted to say thank you to Rachel and Santiago and Rebecca and Raja from the team at Remix who worked really hard on this. Lastly, I will just say, we showed you the website. It will be live in about a week. We will send that out to all panelists when it's been moved over to the correct domain and it's been approved. But thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you, Madlyn.
Thank you so much to Russ, to Rachel, and of course to Sebastian. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know that I'm speaking just for myself here, but I feel like I can speak for a lot of us when I say that we're very excited to see how the website turns out. So now we're gonna hand things over to Annie Chang, who is the head of new mobility for SAE International.
Sure. Thank you so much. So first, thanks, Sebastian, Russ, and Rachel. I'm super excited to see this tool go live and work with it. I definitely appreciated participating and listening in to the dialogues that took place as and served as the foundation of your tool. With that, maybe I can delve right into our work at the Mobility Data Collaborative, which we think is highly complementary to NUMO's work. So next slide, please. All right, so my name is Annie Chang. I oversee SAE International's research and standards portfolio in new mobility, which includes shared and micromobility. I am also the director of the Mobility Data Collaborative, which is a consortium on data sharing. I'm joined today by Dr. Regina Clewlow from Populus and Greg Rodriguez from Stantec, whom we have been fortunate to have has served as our technical leads for the two best practices that we'll be going over today. So next slide. We are a very young initiative, and we come in a form of a consortium we launched at the end of last year. Our joint vision is secure and effective sharing of mobility data to promote equitable and livable streets for everyone. And our mission is to bring together key stakeholders from various sectors to really advance the dialogue around mobility data sharing and create frameworks. Next slide. So this is an example of our current partners. We have a mix of public agencies, operators, data platforms, nonprofits, as well as academia. Next. We have 6 guiding principles, and it really guides our work and governance structure. One thing is that we are very keen to collaborate with others in the community to really ensure that our work is complementary rather than duplicative. So this is why we're very happy to work with NUMO on this webinar. And one other thing is that we do act with a sense of urgency. Our 2 best practices that Regina and Greg will walk us through took less than 6 months in total to finish. So we're very proud of our achievement in that sense. So with that, I'd like to invite Regina to walk us through the glossary and metrics.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. And first off, thanks to the NUMO and SAE team for having me present as part of this webinar. As a quick personal introduction, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Populus. We're a data platform that empowers cities to manage the future of mobility. We've been helping 70 cities around the world securely access data from mobility operators and also deliver solutions that help them digitally communicate new policies such as street closures and new curb rules to share and help manage the public right-of-way. When we started working with cities in early 2018 to help them analyze data from shared electric scooter companies, one of the things we found is that a lot of the operating permits defined performance metrics such as deployed vehicle and vehicle caps in ways that were sometimes inconsistent across cities. And we also found that many operators didn't necessarily interpret the metrics in the same way. So that motivated this first project, which was to help develop basically a glossary to ensure that cities and operators were speaking the same language when it came to micromobility performance metrics. It's kind of pretty simple. If you don't know what the rules are, it's kind of hard to follow them. And it's also, from a city perspective, really hard to enforce rules if you haven't defined them clearly. So Toole Design and Populus took on this first project, and I'll briefly share the results today. Next slide. So for those of you on the call who may not spend every day thinking about mobility data, when dockless scooters came along, there were a lot of different data standards that had existed and new ones that were developed. Many cities that had been kind of caught off guard by services like Uber and Lyft were much more quick to adopt new policies, and with those policies, that typically included the requirement to share data. Shared scooters are fairly easily regulated because they're small and left in the public right-of-way. And so this requirement to share data was pretty comprehensive and spread across many cities around the world. Initially, many cities required static historic reports and GBFS data, general bike share feed specification data. I'm not going to go too into the weeds, but if you are interested in diving deep into the weeds, we just released a new report on the topic, A Practical Guide to Mobility Data Sharing in Cities. We also talk about some of the key privacy issues and privacy policies that are continuing to evolve that you can access on our website, and we've provided the link there. Next slide. So despite the availability of data standards that essentially opens up the flow of data from mobility operators to cities, what was still often missing from the equation for cities and operators were consistent definitions about performance metrics that operators might be held accountable to in, for example, an operating permit. So for this SAE project, Toole and Populus primarily focused on metrics that were readily available through the standards that I just described, including GBFS and the mobility data specification. And B, we focused on metrics that were typically used as performance metrics to make key decisions about mobility programs, including, for example, should the program continue, should X, Y, or Z operator be allowed to continue to operate, and other such policies that would actually materially influence how many vehicles an operator might be allowed to operate. Next slide. So the metrics glossary, which you can download on the SAE Mobility Data Collaborative website, was purposefully designed to be similar to something like a national transit database. For those of you who work in the transit space, the National Transit Database Glossary covers a number of key metrics that are used in evaluating performance and funding from the FTA. So we included vehicle status definitions, trip definitions, trip time definitions, and then specifically, I think one of the key contributions was the vehicle-based performance metrics, including specifically how you might count towards vehicles towards, for example, a vehicle cap. We also had trip-based definitions. We saw a lot of confusion sometimes about whether or not a trip that started in one jurisdiction but might have ended in another jurisdiction should count when considering, for example, how to calculate a utilization rate. Next slide. So I'll end here with one overview slide on the key vehicle definitions, and our hope is that they are pretty straightforward. We very purposefully chose terms that most transportation professionals would naturally interpret the correct way, and in the glossary we very clearly outline the specific definitions for each of these terms to reduce any ambiguity. The way that we settled on these terms is that over the course of about 3 months, Toole and Populus reviewed over 20 different city operating permits. We developed an initial draft of these terms that we took to multiple cities, mobility operators, and academics, and other key stakeholders such as transportation planning firms to solicit feedback. We then refined the terms and then held a workshop at the Transportation Research Board in January, which feels like ages ago, to solicit further feedback, particularly from regulatory agencies and operators. And what you can download on the SAE website is the culmination of months of feedback from operators and cities to develop that common understanding of these terms. So in closing, our hope is, we know a lot of cities are seeing micromobility return, and as new mobility permits roll out or programs roll out this year, we hope that cities and operators find these definitions useful so that everyone's on the same page and there'll be fewer sources of tension around whether or not an operator is over a vehicle cap or below utilization rate, simply because perhaps we weren't comparing apples to apples last year. So if you have any additional feedback, I look forward to the conversation at the end of this webinar, and feel free to also reach out to us and the Populus team. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Regina. And so just want to pick up where Regina left off, and of course want to start by thanking NUMO for this opportunity, and also SAE, and want to compliment Annie's great work around the Mobility Data Collaborative. I know I was really excited to be a part of this project. So for those who don't know me, my name is Greg Rodriguez. I'm Mobility Policy Principal at Stantec. And so before coming to Stantec, I was actually a practicing attorney doing a lot of work with local governments, and very involved in the next generation mobility space, including thinking about data sharing and is really focused in on some issues that led our work around the data governance and contracting guidelines that we'll be talking about today. But those core issues, we're really thinking about privacy, contracting, and transparency with regard to the data sharing that's happening, and that tracks Russ's conversation around the implosion or fast-moving space of micromobility that we all saw last year. And I want to, thank Russ for setting the stage around the introduction of use cases. I appreciated, Russ's comments around how can we be more forward-thinking and proactive. I know that's a challenge, having been in-house counsel at the San Diego Association of Governments and having worked inside public agencies. That's sometimes a challenge where public agencies tend to be reactive as opposed to proactive, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think here, especially around the important issue of data, we have a huge opportunity to make sure we're getting this right. And so that was part of the motivation around how we started off with our work around these guidelines. And so we brought together the diverse and very talented group that Annie described early on about who makes up the MDC. And our goal was really to focus in on how can we promote alignment around the use of data and to really think about these more complicated foundational issues like privacy, contracting, and making sure that users understand how their data is being used and managed. And at the outset, I really want to make it clear that the guidelines are not intended to stop mobility data sharing. I know sometimes when the word privacy is brought up in this conversation, people tend to react as, oh, it's just being used as a way to inhibit data sharing or to say we can't do it. Our approach was instead to think about how can we make sure privacy is a part of the conversation, but still moving forward to make sure that we're encouraging the sharing and use of data. Data is being used in so many different ways. Russ talked about all the different use cases. I'm really looking forward to seeing that website when it comes out. We're doing a lot of work at Stantec around data analytics, but making sure that we're including the conversation around data governance was really an important part of where we started and an important motivation. Next slide, please. So here you'll see these are all the different the titles of the guidelines. When you hopefully take a look at the document, if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to go to the SAE website, the Mobility Data Collaborative website, and download this document and read it and think about it, because that was, we put a lot of effort into this. It started from a place where we had those motivating factors and really leveraged and really try to have a proactive conversation, a collaborative discussion with all the different groups involved that are so passionate around realizing the vision around the future of mobility, which is everything we're talking about today, a more equitable, a more inclusive, a more transformative transportation system. And a big part of that's going to be data. So again, we didn't shy away from that. So when you do download the document and when you look at the guidelines, these are just the title or different guidelines 1 through 10. You'll see more when you open it. So then you'll see an objective that ties to each specific guideline, and then recommended next steps around how to hopefully move forward to make that guideline a reality. And just as an example, which ties into the use case conversation, how do we standardize and think about approaching privacy risk assessments? And so that is a great example of why use cases are so important. You can't do the appropriate risk analysis until you understand how the data is going to be used. So that gets to the ultimate question of, why are we collecting the data and how do we plan to use it? And then once we know that, then we can do the proper risk analysis to make sure that we're thinking about all the potential pitfalls around the use of data. Privacy is going to be one of them, but so is data security. So is things like open records requests. So are things like, are you going to give the right to third-party contractors to use the data if you're working on a planning project? So again, I really hope people will read the guidelines, see the work that went into them, and how our goal was to make them more than just talking points, to actually make them a living, breathing document that people can use, hopefully adopt for their projects. They're going to be using data, And then the goal is to continue to have these guidelines evolve as the use cases continue to evolve. Next slide, please. So here, I don't want to go into too much because I really want to get to the Q&A because I know there's a lot of very smart people on the phone that can hopefully be asking questions and help us, you know, continue to do outreach around these great projects. But, you know, I think the key takeaways, you know, and I think we were talking about it early on with the development of the use cases and the work NUMO is doing, there's a huge opportunity for education and outreach. And through hopefully the education and outreach around those core themes like contracting, making sure we understand rules and regulations with issues like GDPR and the California Privacy Bill. Now, you know, in the recent House Transportation Authorization Bill, there's discussion around open records. So again, making sure we understand all the different rules and regulations and best practices that are involved. But also, you know, to align our goals and vision. So another key component of the guidelines is saying, you know, this isn't just a public or private sector issue. The public and private sector need to be working together and also thinking about education with our lawmakers and elected officials as well, before we start to perhaps too soon put statutory requirements on the data before we ever understand its potential. And finally, the other issue that we raise in the guidelines is, you know, how can we realize that coordination and collaboration to avoid lawsuits? And I'm sure most of us on the call are probably monitoring and tracking the recent lawsuit filed by the ACLU against LADOT. And whether or not, you know, you agree with that lawsuit or not, I think there's some important takeaways around thinking about, you know, how do we make sure we have the appropriate justifications in place for when we're going to be using data, again, how to do more outreach and education to our citizens as we're starting to collect and use data, and people are becoming more aware of that word geolocation data, especially as we start talking about potential contact tracing apps in response to COVID-19, and just generally to really think about, you know, how can you make sure you have a framework around moving forward in how you're using data. And for those, you know, that are interested of, you know, what can I do with this document? In the document, it talks about, you know, if your organization is currently involved or contemplating using mobility data, then we encourage you to adopt the guidelines. And I know Annie, you know, would welcome talking to you more about how you can do that and be more involved in this conversation, which this is only the first part of the data governance conversation. And we're looking forward to next steps, continue to elaborate upon this project and continue to grow the work as the use cases for data grow. And that's why it's great to be here presenting with NUMO and really appreciate the opportunity. So with that, I will stop and we'll look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much to Greg, to Regina, and of course to Annie and the entire Populus, Stantec, and Mobility Data Collaborative teams. Also, you know, incredible work being done. So we will kick off first. I will introduce both of you again. I'll say that Dr. Stefanie Brodie is a senior researcher for Toole Design Group who specializes in transportation planning and policy. And Josh Johnson is the public policy manager for SPIN. And both were involved in the working group for the NUMO data policy platform and work, and also with SAE's Mobility Data Collaborative. And they're going to talk to us a bit about what we've just heard, how these tools and these guidelines can help cities and companies in having meaningful conversations around mobility data. So we'll jump in. And we'll start with the fact that we've been presented today with two sets of best practices and a number of tools regarding mobility data with policies and uses, privacy and governance. How do you both see these approaches complementing each other in practice? And maybe we'll start with Stefanie.
Sure. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I was involved in both of them, and I started back when I was actually in the public sector. So I was at DDOT for a while and was there when the scooters first came on the scene and worked a lot with their data management of that program. And now on the other side, I've been working with SAE on the metrics as well. So when I was at DDOT, I also started working with NUMO. So there's kind of a long trail of kind of being involved in these projects, and I think they're very complementary. I see the NUMO case studies and in trying to find ways to quantify outcomes as a high-level tool to allow cities and all those really in the industry to identify ways that we can try and measure the outcomes that we're trying to get to. And then the metrics that SAE has worked with, really focusing on kind of the granular aspect. How do we take that data that we're getting from MDS or any sort of feed and make it make sense in a very standardized way to actually evaluate, to be used in evaluating those outcomes. So there's a very clear kind of connection for me in those two.
Makes sense. Josh, how about you?
Sure. Maybe I'll just start also with a brief introduction. Prior to working with SPIN a few months ago, actually making the switch, I was with the city of Minneapolis as the advanced mobility manager and oversaw our work with mobility data. And that's how I started participating with NUMO in the working group for use cases. And then in joining SPIN, started working with MDC. In kind of both of those lives, I saw two ways in which I think these tools complement and help fill gaps that were previously missing for a lot of cities, a lot of the public and private sector, challenges that have been posed in sharing and using mobility data. And that's one, providing opportunities for more specificity and clarity, as Regina talked about in how we're measuring performance and compliance, but also, speaking from with the city, I didn't have necessarily my own unique original thoughts in developing policy related to mobility data. And so having a real understanding of what all the use cases might be, and then how I can kind of populate or measure against those use cases is really valuable, and I think is often missing in a lot of cities in building these programs, especially as people are kind of disconnected from the technical side of sharing data. And I think that's the other way in which these tools complement each other and bringing the policy and the technical side together and kind of building off of each other. So starting with the governance piece and, helping to build smarter, more specific, more proactive agreements regarding data sharing, where previously it was very generic and just trying to get access for the sake of having access and not knowing exactly what to do with it when it comes to mobility data. And so starting from a place where you have good agreements that the public and private sector can agree on those terms, and then building use cases from that, and then having the metrics behind them to have a consistent approach to monitoring compliance, to measuring performance, and kind of holding all accountable. Those are I think the best ways that these tools complement each other.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. This question actually comes from the Q&A section from one of our attendees, but we actually have two from the Q&A section because we think that they're so fantastic. We might as well ask both of you. So when thinking about the privacy implications of collecting mobility data, how much detail is too much detail? Maybe Stefanie, we'll start with you.
So Josh said this, and also Greg said this in talk about the guidelines. I think the first question to ask is why you're asking for the data and what you intend to do with it, and what systems you have set up to secure the data and make sure that it protects the privacy of the user. So I feel like in a lot of data questions, the answer is always it depends. So I don't feel like this might not be the most helpful answer. So maybe Josh might have a more specific one, but there's at least kind of the baseline of if you can identify an individual person, that is not data that you should probably be having. So I think that's at least the baseline that you can go with. And then from there, knowing, like, you can ask questions about kind of the, like, maybe future planning that don't need to have aggregated data at all, or disaggregated data at all. And you can really use kind of like monthly data or like aggregated data on a city or regional level to answer your question. So it really depends on what questions you're asking and what the needs are.
And I would piggyback on that and just mention that, yeah, of course, starting with use cases is a good place to begin. And when I was with the city of Minneapolis, we developed a data methodology which made very clear statements about how we were intending to use mobility data, what use cases it was intended to satisfy, and then even going into like what fields within data specifications we would be using to help kind of populate that. And so I think it really also boils down to what's technically possible may not always align with policy goals or may not always be feasible to implement, and vice versa. And so I think going back to my point about using these tools and you know, connecting technical side of sharing data with the policy side, which often you know, cities have resources for both, but those resources, those staff are not experts in both. And so the conversations can somewhat be disconnected. And so having a resource that helps kind of provide more balance between the two, I think really helps get to that, answering that question of how much data is an appropriate amount to satisfy those use cases and really, you know, measure performance, monitor compliance, and those types of things.
Absolutely, thank you both. What are both of your opinions on the future of micromobility after COVID-19, or, you know, even as we begin to emerge into different stages of reopening in cities around the world, and even in rural cities around the world, when we've seen so many companies, micromobility companies specifically, that have gone out of business during this time?
I guess I'll jump in on that one. I feel that was targeted maybe towards me. You know, I think we see tremendous opportunity in this current time period in helping to really fill gaps that have been created by the need to practice social distancing, the significant disruptions to transit service that has been caused by COVID-19, and really help kind of build a more resilient transportation system that doesn't rely on, or that can help those who need it to not rely on one single mode, help fill in gaps, and you know, really continue to move forward, providing people access to jobs and those essential services that they need in a way that's safe and sanitary, of course, you know, following appropriate guidance from the CDC, and really comfortable. And I think that's where our opportunity lies. We've seen tremendous growth over the past few months coming out of kind of the peak when shelter-in-place orders went into effect. And we're continuing to see longer trips. We're continuing to see more new active users. And I think we'll just continue from there. And we, of course, want to be emerging from COVID-19 in a place where we can continue to help fill those gaps, help position scooters as an essential service, which I think we've very much seen over the course of the past few months, that it's not just recreation, and it is truly, you know, for utility purposes and for accessing those jobs and trips that you know, people need most during this time and you know, beyond.
And I'll just add, I know a lot of our conversation today is about scooters, but if we talk about station-based micromobility, bike share, we're seeing across the country a big uptick in usage. So that's also a knowing positive direction for micromobility use after COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps one last question, since we've touched on COVID-19 too, let's take a look at the broader world context as well. How do you think these two pieces of work that we've been presented with today support larger social equity issues that are happening today?
Good question. I think, just generally having meaningful conversations, having a place to start from that's more neutral and less skewed from one side to the other, because there's very much, to this point, been, mistrust sown on each side, the public and private sector, when it comes to micromobility and data sharing. And so I think having the opportunity to bring the public and private sector together in a place that can kind of bridge that gap that had previously existed and collaborate, I think that proves, that will prove beneficial for, much larger outcomes. And of course, that pales in comparison to, the social justice issues that we're faced and have been faced over the past month, but I think, can be a microcosm of how to move forward together, helping to recognizing that each can't do it on its own, whether it's related to transportation, social justice, or, something else that, in working together, addressing, these, very significant crises, we can emerge in a better place, certainly.
I'll just talk about two kind of specific places where I see an opportunity for both of these initiatives to support kind of improvements in equity. The first being in the privacy guidelines. So really finding ways to support individual privacy to ensure that we're not creating tools that can then be used as enforcement or targeting tools. So that's kind of one really clear way. And the second is in the NUMO kind of focuses on outcomes. One is equity, and then equity is tied throughout all the other ones as well. So I think that providing a tool that helps to articulate the ways that we might evaluate equity and what concerns we might have in terms of equity of these systems, and then having that available for cities, for agencies, to not have to spend the time thinking through it themselves, but having a place where there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of thought put into what those measures might be, and having that available to them also helps to start the conversation a little bit ahead of the game. So I think that those are two real specific ways that this is helpful.
Thank you both very much. We so much appreciate both of your insight and your answers to these very important questions that everyone in this space, mobility data in general, and also transportation, transit, et cetera, we're all dealing with today, yesterday, probably tomorrow, most likely tomorrow. So now we'll actually move on to the Q&A portion. So I think Sebastian's actually going to give me a little bit of help in that, but we've got a couple of questions.
So yeah, perhaps we can start, there were a couple of questions, a bit of process. I think people were interested in understanding a bit better how the process of producing these pieces of work came about. So perhaps to Regina, Greg, and Russ, if you can tell us a bit more about, how much time this took, a bit more perhaps about the composition of the different groups. So yeah, just, a few questions around that topic.
Greg, I'd be happy to dive in. Oh, sorry.
No, go right ahead, Regina.
So I can chime in on the topic of the mobility metrics report specifically. I believe we kicked off in around September or October of last year. And the initial phase of the project was focused on gathering all of the existing data and information that was publicly available about mobility operating permits. So these were traditionally centered around scooter operating permits that cities had adopted with regards to their requirements around data sharing and performance metrics. And then we began to flesh out an initial set of performance metrics. The composition of the initial meetings was primarily cities and agencies and operators, transportation consulting firms, and academics that are part of the SAE Mobility Data Collaborative. And then we had several sessions where we opened up the conversation to essentially anyone who wanted to participate over webinar calls. And then at TRB, we had a larger session with mostly regulatory agencies and operators to basically further refine the metrics to get us to the final stage that they're at today. So that process was about 5 months.
For us at NUMO, it really started with a core group of operators, of aggregators, of cities. We really started quite small. We started with 12 or 15 people, I think, in the idea that we could work with that group to develop a really solid framework to proceed forward with the working group. And then every month when we held another activity, we brought in more people. And the way that we ran it was really topically based. So every month we really tried to tackle a different topic, whether it be equity or safety and environment, and then invited stakeholders who their primary focus of their work was equity or safety or environment. So that was the kind of the strategy that we took. We held an in-person meeting in Toronto at the NACTO meeting in September, and then we followed it up with another in-person meeting in January at Transforming Transportation, and then held virtual meetings every month in between there and then after. And I think we started at about 12 or 15, as I said, and I think we ended up with about 65 different participants through that kind of 6-month process as well.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you for that. So there's a question that's a bit specific to the US context, but I think it's very relevant. So I'd just like to pose it openly to anyone to answer. So the House T&I Invest in America Act calls for US DOT to start a rulemaking process to set up an open standard and API for data sharing. So anyone, again, on the panel would like to share your opinion about that approach and how a national government or the federal government in the US is proposing something like this, and is it timely or is there other ways of doing this?
I can jump in to start the conversation. So, and maybe Russ, you'll chime in after me, and Regina as well, of course. I think we all have opinions on this, but I think, the challenge is we started the data sharing before we had a framework in place around how the data was going to be shared in a standardized way. And then also thinking about all the challenging issues that we're talking about on the call today. So, making sure that everybody understands all the different parts that go into data sharing. It's not just a data sharing agreement, it's also the licensing of the data and who owns it, who has access to the data. How do we manage things like public record laws, which are different, across the 50 states across the country. So on one hand, it's good to see some leadership and maybe a centralized approach. On the other hand, I think, those of us that have been involved with any sort of rulemaking know it takes a long time. I think the interesting part of this proposal is that it's a proposed negotiated rulemaking, which means we try and get through some of the different nuances or some of the different opinions up front by having all the right people in place. But, my kind of theme around everything around next generation mobility right now is we don't even know what's possible yet. So maybe if we directed funding towards some of the projects like NUMO's doing around use cases, support SAE's work around building out these guidelines and metrics that are already in place, and then we start to do a rulemaking once we have some models in place. It's just trying to figure out what's the best approach moving forward that's efficient and also takes into account all the different viewpoints which Russ and Regina talked about as we worked around these initiatives.
I can also chime in and definitely agree with a lot of Greg, your comments on that particular initiative. I think that One thing that I find concerning, and maybe it's really just an issue of language, but the idea that there would be one standard or one API doesn't make a lot of technical sense or practical sense to me. We know that there are already multiple standards that exist for sharing transit data, such as GTFS, GBFS. There are various standards that are continuing to evolve around street closures and curb rules. And I think that it's just impractical to think that there would be one universal standard for all modes that operate in the public right-of-way. So I think that's one key challenge. I think, we've talked about a lot of the other issues that have become, concerns around mobility data sharing. And I think it's really important to identify the data use cases and privacy principles around how data should be shared before we start making it very easy for data to flow between various parties without those frameworks in place, which is, I think, what has happened over the last 2 years. And we've been really cognizant of how that's changing the landscape and some of the privacy policies and initiatives that are moving forward in California and other places.
Yeah, I think I would just add in that in theory is a lot different than in practice, especially when it comes to the federal government. And just thinking about automated vehicle data as a kind of an analog, or I suppose that may be a poor choice, but as a proxy, really Congress's best shot was to bottle it up and spend a few years debating about who owned it and who had access to it, as opposed to thinking about outcomes or how it might be used beneficially. And I would also say the recent US DOT initiative on AV data sharing that just came out is largely kind of toothless and voluntary. And so I think it's great to talk about. I think the reality of something happening there is probably a long ways away.
Excellent. Thank you all. We're out of time, so we're just going to close now. We have many other questions. We'll try to get to them offline, so we'll reach out to you directly. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Madlyn?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Huge thank you, of course, to Russ, to Rachel, to Regina, Greg, to Stefanie, to Josh, to Annie, to Sebastian, everybody who was on the webinar today. Thank you to everyone who attended. We really appreciate your time in this ever increasingly busy world. You can follow up with us with some of the links that are on the screen here. Again, NUMO will be reaching out shortly with the data policy platform. So thank you again and have a great rest of your day.